This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Punishing rapids had left the expedition on the verge of disaster. Roosevelt and his men had already lost 5 of their 7 canoes and most of their provisions, and 1 man had perished. What lay around the next bend was anyone's guess. Even Colonel Candido Rondon, the expedition's Brazilian co-commander, who had explored more of the Amazon than any other man alive, had no idea where the uncharted river would take them. For Roosevelt's men, fears for their own survival were eclipsed only by despair about the fate of their leader. As Roosevelt's fever soared to 105 degrees, Cherry and Kermit, Roosevelt's second son, were certain that they were witnessing his final hours. "The scene is vivid before me," Kermit would later recall. "The black rushing river with the great trees towering high above along the bank, the sodden earth underfoot. For a few moments the stars would be shining, and then the sky would cloud over and the rain would fall in torrents, shutting out the sky and trees and river." As the fever-racked former president drifted in and out of consciousness, he slipped into a trance-like delirium, reciting over and over again the opening lines to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan. "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree. In Xanadu..." Part 1. Breaking Away. Chapter 1. Defeat. The line outside Madison Square Garden started to form at 5:30 p.m., just as an orange autumn sun was setting in New York City on Halloween Eve, 1912. The doors were not scheduled to open for another hour and a half, but the excitement surrounding the Progressive Party's last major rally of the presidential campaign promised a packed house. The party was still in its infancy, fighting for a foothold in its first national election, but it had something that the Democrats had never had and the Republicans had lately lost, the star attraction that drew tens of thousands of people to the Garden that night: Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, one of the most popular presidents in his nation's history, had vowed never to run again after winning his second term in the White House in 1904. But now, just 8 years later, he was not only running for a third term, he was, to the horror and outrage of his old Republican backers, running as a third-party candidate against Democrats and Republicans alike. Roosevelt's decision to abandon the Republican Party and run as a progressive had been bitterly criticized, not just because he was muddying the political waters, but because he still had a large and almost fanatically loyal following. Roosevelt was 5 feet 8 inches tall, about average height for an American man in the early 20th century, weighed more than 200 pounds, and had a voice that sounded as if he had just taken a sip of helium. But his outsized personality made him unforgettable and utterly irresistible. He delighted in leaning over the podium as though he were about to snatch his audience up by its collective collar. He talked fast, pounded his fists, waved his arms, and sent a current of electricity through the crowd. Such unbounded energy and vitality impressed one like the perennial forces of nature, the naturalist John Burroughs once wrote of Roosevelt. When he came into the room, it was as if a strong wind had blown the door open. Not surprisingly, Roosevelt was proving to be dangerous competition for the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson, to say nothing of President William Howard Taft, the lackluster Republican incumbent whom Roosevelt had handpicked to be his successor in the White House 4 years earlier. It was a bitterly contested race, and Roosevelt hoped that this rally, strategically scheduled just a week before Election Day, could help swing the vote in his favor. Before the doors even opened, more than 100,000 people were swarming the sidewalks and choking the surrounding cobblestone streets. Men and boys nimbly wove their way through the crowd, boldly hawking tickets in plain sight of 100 uniformed policemen. The scalpers had their work cut out for them selling tickets in the churning throng. Days earlier, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party in honor of its tenacious leader, had posted a "No More Tickets" sign, but brokers and street corner salesmen had continued to do a brisk business. Dollar seats went for as much as $7, roughly $130 in today's money, and the priciest tickets in the house could set the buyer back as much as $100. Inside the auditorium, Edith Roosevelt, every inch the aristocrat, with her softly cleft chin and long, elegant neck, was seated in a box above the fray when a mighty roar rose up from the audience, heralding her husband's entrance. 4 colossal American flags greeted Roosevelt, waving grandly from the girdered ceiling, and an entire massive bull moose stood mounted on a pedestal and bathed in a white spotlight, its head raised high, its ears erect, as if about to charge. Roosevelt, still famously energetic at 54, greeted his admirers with characteristic vigor, pumping his left arm in the air like a windmill. His right arm, however, hung motionless at his side. The last time Roosevelt had given a speech, just 2 weeks earlier in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he had been shot in the chest by a 36-year-old New York bartender named John Schrank, a Bavarian immigrant who feared that Roosevelt's run for a third term was an effort to establish a monarchy in the United States. Incredibly, Roosevelt's heavy army overcoat and the folded 50-page manuscript and steel spectacle case he carried in his right breast pocket had saved his life, but the bullet had plunged some 5 inches deep, lodging near his rib cage. That night, whether out of an earnest desire to deliver his message or merely an egotist's love of drama, Roosevelt had insisted on delivering his speech to a terrified and transfixed audience. His coat unbuttoned to reveal a blood-stained shirt, and his speech held high so that all could see the 2 sinister-looking holes made by the assailant's bullet, Roosevelt had shouted, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Now, in Madison Square Garden, as the boisterous cheering went on for 41 minutes, Roosevelt still had one of Schrank's bullets in his chest. At 10:03 p.m., pounding on the flag-draped desk in front of him and nervously snapping his jaws, he finally convinced the crowd that he was in earnest, and the hall slowly quieted. Unaided by a loudspeaker, an invention that would revolutionize public speaking the following year, he began his speech. "Friends!" At the sound of his voice, the crowd erupted into a thunderous cheer that continued for 2 more minutes. When it tapered off, he began again. "My friends," he said, "perhaps once in a generation—" Suddenly, from seats close to the platform, a clamor arose as policemen tried to push back several people who had forced their way into the hall. Bending forward, Roosevelt bellowed, "Keep those people quiet, please. Officers, be quiet." Then, in a voice that filled the auditorium, Theodore Roosevelt launched into the last great campaign speech of his political career. "Friends, perhaps once in a generation, perhaps not so often, there comes a chance for the people of a country to play their part wisely and fearlessly in some great battle of the age-long warfare for human rights." He still had the old percussive rhythm, exploding his P's and B's with vigor, but his tone had lost the violence, and his words the bitterness of the past. He did not attack his opponents, the coolly academic Wilson or the genial Taft. Instead, he talked in broad terms about character, moral strength, compassion, and responsibility. "We do not set greed against greed, or hatred against hatred," he thundered. "Our creed is one that bids us to be just to all, to feel sympathy for all, and to strive for an understanding of the needs of all. Our purpose is to smite down wrong." To the people in the hall and to millions of Americans, Roosevelt was a hero, a leader, an icon. But even as he stood on the stage at Madison Square Garden, he knew that in 6 days he would lose not only the election, but also this bright, unblinking spotlight. He would be reviled by many and then ignored by all.